Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. Imagine a prince, born to rule the world's most powerful empire, yet his world is a single, gilded room. For 39 years, he breathes the same stale air, listening for the footsteps that might bring a throne or a silk cord for his neck. This is not a fairy tale. It is the chilling reality of the Ottoman Kafes, the cage. We will uncover the story of a man who survived 4 decades of gilded imprisonment, a prince erased from history, only to be thrust onto the throne at the empire's darkest hour. This is the story of Suleiman II. In the heart of the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire was a behemoth groaning under the weight of its own immense power. Its capital, Constantinople, was a city of gilded domes and shadowed alleys, where whispers held more power than edicts. It was into this gilded cage of intrigue and paranoia that a prince was born on April 15th, 1642. His name was Suleiman, a name that echoed the golden age of his great ancestor, the Magnificent. But this was not a golden age. This was the era of his father, Sultan Ibrahim, a ruler whose mind was a labyrinth of trauma and excess. Ibrahim had spent over 2 decades in the Kafes, the gilded prison for princes, watching his brothers be executed, expecting the bowstring at any moment. When he was finally thrust onto the throne, he was a broken man, ill-equipped to rule the most powerful empire on earth. His court was a theatre of the bizarre, ruled by his whims, the greed of his favorites, and the iron will of his mother, the Valide Kösem Sultan. The birth of a son should have been a moment of pure celebration, a guarantee of the dynasty's continuation. For the infant Suleiman, however, his first breaths were of an air thick with conspiracy. He was not just a son, he was a political asset, a potential rival, another piece in the deadly game of succession. While he lay in a cradle adorned with silks and jewels, the empire his father nominally ruled was teetering. The janissaries grew restless. The treasury was being emptied to fund Ibrahim's insatiable desires for sable furs and beautiful women, and the grand viziers were replaced and executed with terrifying frequency. Suleiman was born not into the promise of a throne, but into the eye of a storm. His nursery in the Topkapi Palace was not a sanctuary, but the silent, opulent center of a political earthquake, and its tremors would define every moment of his tragic life. For a child, the world is a series of sensory impressions. For the 6-year-old Prince Suleiman, the world was the scent of jasmine in the palace gardens, the cool marble under his feet, and the towering, unpredictable figure of his father, the Sultan. But in August of 1648, that world shattered into a million pieces of terror and confusion. The storm that had been gathering throughout Ibrahim's reign finally broke. The state could no longer bear his erratic rule. The ulama, the religious authorities, issued a fatwa for his deposition. The janissaries, the heart of the Ottoman military, rose in revolt, their roars echoing through the palace courtyards. This was not a distant political event for Suleiman. It was the sound of his universe collapsing. He, along with his 7-year-old brother Mehmed, were torn from the harem's sanctuary. They were presented before the assembled grandees and mutinous soldiers, their small bodies trembling. Their father was gone, dragged away and imprisoned in the very chambers where he himself had spent his youth in terror. The architects of the coup, including the prince's own grandmother, Kösem Sultan, needed a new sultan. The choice fell upon the eldest, Mehmed. A 7-year-old boy was girded with the sword of Osman, becoming Sultan Mehmed IV. But the fate of Ibrahim was not yet sealed. For 10 days, the deposed sultan raged in his cell, his cries a haunting reminder of his presence. The new regime, terrified he could become a rallying point for loyalists, made a final, brutal decision. On August 18th, 1648, the chief executioner and his assistants entered Ibrahim's cell. The boy Prince Suleiman did not see the act, but the palace itself seemed to hold its breath. He would have felt the shockwave of silence that followed the strangled cries of his father. An Ottoman sultan, the shadow of God on earth, had been executed by the order of his own state. For Suleiman, this was the ultimate formative lesson. No one was safe. The throne was not a divine right, it was a precipice, and the fall was merciless. With his father dead and his child brother on the throne, Suleiman's status changed in an instant. He was no longer simply a prince, he was a threat. In the brutal calculus of Ottoman power, any male of the dynasty was a potential rival, a seed from which a rebellion could grow. The old solution was fratricide. A new sultan would often execute all his brothers to secure his reign. But the empire had grown weary of the bloodshed. A new, supposedly more humane solution had been devised decades earlier, the Kafes, or the cage. For Suleiman, now 6 years old, this would be his new home. He was taken to a luxurious suite of apartments within the sprawling Topkapi Palace, a section known as the Şimşirlik. The doors that closed behind him were not of iron, but of inlaid wood and gold. His chambers were adorned with the finest Iznik tiles, plush carpets, and stained glass windows that cast jewel-toned light across the silent rooms. He was attended by deaf-mute servants, chosen to ensure that no plots could be whispered, no secrets carried out. He had tutors, books, and every material comfort. Yet, it was the most profound prison imaginable. The Kafes was a place where time itself seemed to congeal. It was a life of suspended animation, a living death. He could see the Golden Horn from his windows, hear the sounds of the vibrant capital, but he could not participate. He was a spectator to his own life, a ghost haunting the palace. The purpose of the cage was not just to confine the body, but to atrophy the mind. Princes were deliberately kept ignorant of statecraft, military matters, and the world outside. They were encouraged to indulge in trivial hobbies, to lose themselves in pleasure or piety, to become harmless. For young Suleiman, traumatized by his father's murder, the closing of those golden doors marked the beginning of an endless, terrifying wait. Every day, he would wake with the same question hanging over him. Would this be the day he was called to the throne, or the day the executioners came for him? As Suleiman passed from childhood to adolescence, and then to manhood within the silent confines of the Kafes, his brother, Mehmed IV, grew into his role as Sultan. Known as Avcı, or the Hunter, Mehmed spent much of his long reign away from the capital, consumed by his passion for grand hunting expeditions. For the caged prince, his brother was a distant, almost mythical figure. He was the source of all authority, the man whose signature could end his life in a moment. Yet he was a stranger. Suleiman would hear reports of his brother's life, of great battles fought against the Habsburgs and Poles, of the siege of Vienna, of the birth of Mehmed's own sons, who now stood ahead of him in the line of succession. Each piece of news was a reminder of the world he was forbidden from. While Mehmed commanded armies, Suleiman studied calligraphy. While Mehmed held court, Suleiman paced the length of his gilded rooms. The psychological torment was immense. He lived in a state of perpetual limbo, stripped of purpose and agency. His days were a monotonous cycle of prayer, reading, and quiet contemplation, punctuated by the ever-present fear. Every footstep in the corridor, every unexpected summons, could signal his end. The politics of the outer world still managed to seep through the walls of his prison. During times of military defeat or political instability, the caged princes became dangerous again. Whispers of placing a new, more competent sultan on the throne would put Suleiman and his other confined brothers in mortal danger. A failed plot could mean a preemptive execution for all potential heirs to eliminate any threat. His brother, the sultan, was therefore both his protector and his jailer. Mehmed's continued reign was the very reason for Suleiman's confinement, but Mehmed's life was also the only thing standing between Suleiman and the executioner's bowstring. It was a suffocating paradox. For decades, he existed not as a person, but as a contingency, a spare life kept in reserve by the state, waiting for a destiny he increasingly believed would never arrive. In the suffocating silence of the Kafes, every sound was magnified, every shadow held a potential threat. But for Prince Suleiman, one sound, one thought, eclipsed all others: the whisper of the silk cord. This was not the rustle of fine garments, or the gentle pull of a curtain. This was the sound of dynastic law, the chilling instrument of fratricide. In the Ottoman tradition, the shedding of royal blood was a sacrilege. And so, a more elegant, more intimate solution was devised. A simple cord of braided silk, pulled tight around the neck by deaf-mute executioners who could neither hear a prince's pleas nor speak of what they had done. For Suleiman, this was not an abstract horror. It was a family memory. He was old enough to remember the chaos surrounding the deposition of his father, Ibrahim. He was certainly aware of the fate of his own brothers. The politics of the harem, orchestrated by powerful queen mothers like his grandmother Kösem and his own mother Saliha Dilashub, were a game played with the lives of their sons. Every time a new crisis gripped the empire, every time his reigning brother, Mehmed IV, faced a military defeat or a Janissary revolt, the whispers would begin anew in the palace corridors. A new sultan is needed. The caged princes are a liability. Suleiman would lie awake on his silken cushions, listening. Were those footsteps in the hall meant for him? Was the creak of a distant door the prelude to his own final moments? The executioners of the Bostansi Corps were known for their speed and silence. There would be no warning, just the quiet entry of powerful men, a flash of purpose in their eyes, and the final suffocating embrace of the cord. This was the psychological torture embedded within the very architecture of the Kafes. It wasn't merely a prison of stone and gold. It was a waiting room for a death that could arrive at any moment, for any reason, or for no reason at all. Each sunrise was a temporary reprieve, each sunset a renewal of the long, dark vigil. The world of Prince Suleiman had shrunk to the dimensions of a few opulent rooms. This was the great paradox of the Kafes. He was surrounded by a level of luxury most people could only dream of. The walls were adorned with exquisite Iznik tiles, depicting intricate floral patterns in vibrant blues and reds. The floors were covered in the finest Heraki carpets, their softness muffling his restless pacing. His food was served on delicate porcelain, his water in jewel-encrusted goblets. Yet this splendor was a mockery, a gilded cage in the most literal sense. His only connection to the outside world, his only portal to life beyond his prison, was a single, large window. But even this view was fractured, controlled. It was covered by a mashrabiyah, an ornate latticed screen of carved wood. Through its geometric patterns, Suleiman could see fragments of the Topkapi Palace courtyard. He could not see a whole person, only a passing leg or the flash of a guard's uniform. He could not see the horizon, only a sliver of the Istanbul sky, its color shifting from the pearly grey of dawn to the fiery orange of sunset. The sounds were similarly distorted. The clang of the palace blacksmith, the distant shouts of janissaries at drill, the mournful call to prayer from the Hagia Sophia, they all reached him as muffled echoes, ghosts of a life being lived by others. His companions were carefully chosen to enforce his isolation. Deaf-mute servants attended to his needs, their gestures and expressions a silent language he had decades to master. They were his waiters, his cleaners, his chamberlains, but they could never be his confidants. They could carry no messages, report no conversations. They were living walls, as impenetrable as the stone ones. Even the women sent to his chambers were part of this curated reality, chosen for their beauty and their inability to pose a political threat. Through that latticed window, Suleiman watched seasons turn into years and years into decades. He saw the world not as a grand panorama, but as a collection of broken, tantalizing glimpses, a constant reminder of everything he had and everything he had lost. How does a man endure 39 years of silence? Not the silence of a monastery, chosen for contemplation, but an imposed silence, a void designed to break the human spirit. For Suleiman, the passing of time became a strange, fluid concept. Days bled into weeks, Seasons blurred into an endless cycle of sameness. The vibrant, ambitious boy of 6 had to find a way to survive into middle age within these same walls, a challenge not of the body, but of the mind. His survival depended on discipline. The Ottomans, for all the cruelty of the Kafes, did not wish for an uneducated sultan should the need arise. He was provided with tutors, but his curriculum was carefully sanitized. He could study theology, losing himself in the divine geometry of the Quran. He could delve into poetry, the verses of Rumi or Kafes offering a metaphorical escape. He became an accomplished calligrapher, his hand meticulously forming the elegant Arabic script, each stroke a small act of control in a life devoid of it. Calligraphy was more than an art. It was a meditation, a way to channel his focus and impose order on the chaos of his thoughts. But what of the hours between lessons, between meals, between prayers? This was the true test. The crushing monotony, the absence of meaningful conversation, the lack of any new stimulus. This was the environment where madness could take root. Did he talk to himself, his voice a strange intrusion in the quiet rooms? Did he pace the length of his chambers thousands, millions of times, the pattern worn into the priceless carpets? He watched from his cage as his brother, Mehmed IV, ruled for 39 years, an entire lifetime. He heard the distant echoes of grand campaigns, of victories in Crete and devastating defeats at the gates of Vienna. He was a spectator to his own dynasty's history, a forgotten footnote in the imperial chronicle. 39 years, long enough for empires to rise and fall. Long enough for a man to forget the sound of his own name spoken in conversation. It was a silence so profound, so absolute, that it hollowed him out, replacing the fire of youth with the cold, patient resignation of a man who expects to die where he lives. The Kafes was a crowded place, though Suleiman was almost always alone. It was crowded with ghosts. They were not spectral apparitions in the night, but the far more terrifying phantoms of memory and blood. The most formidable ghost was that of his father, Sultan Ibrahim. Known to history as Ibrahim the Mad, his erratic and decadent reign had ended in deposition and execution. Suleiman lived under the shadow of that legacy, fearing that the same madness might run in his veins, a seed of instability waiting to sprout in the fertile ground of isolation. Was his composure a mask? Was the silence preserving his sanity or slowly eroding it? Then there were the ghosts of his brothers, the princes who had shared this fate but had not survived it. He would have known them as children, played with them in the palace gardens before the cage door closed. Now, their spectres were a constant reminder of his own precarious existence. He was the survivor, but survival in the Kafes came with its own heavy burden of guilt and fear. Every footstep, every political rumor could signal that his time had come to join them in the imperial crypt. The gilded room was also haunted by the ghost of the man he might have become. A warrior, a governor, a statesman. Like all Ottoman princes, he was born and bred for power, trained from a young age to one day command armies and rule a vast empire. That potential, that entire lifetime of possibility, had been murdered on the day he was incarcerated. All that remained was the ghost of that future, taunting him with visions of battles he never fought and decrees he never issued. As the decades wore on, the outside world became a ghost as well. The empire he knew as a child was not the same empire of his middle age. Grand viziers rose and fell, wars were won and lost, territories were gained and surrendered. He was a living relic, a man out of time, his knowledge of the world frozen in the year 1648. The Kafes was more than his prison, it was his tomb, and he was its lonely breathing ghost, waiting for a death that had been delayed for 39 long years. Within the gilded silence of the Kafes, the world was a collection of muted sounds and filtered light. For Prince Suleiman, 35 years had passed in this suspended state, a lifetime measured not in seasons, but in the changing patterns of sunlight on the Iznik tiles. He was a ghost in his own palace, a forgotten son of a long-dead sultan. But beyond his marbled prison, the Ottoman Empire, The very world that had discarded him was stirring with a feverish energy. The whispers that reached him through his attendants spoke of a new, colossal ambition, one that emanated from the Grand Vizier, the formidable Kara Mustafa Pasha. He was a man of immense power and even greater pride, driven by a desire to etch his name alongside the legends. He saw an opportunity, not just for conquest, but for eternal glory. Vienna, the heart of the Habsburg enemy, the city that had defied even Suleiman the Magnificent. To take Vienna would be to complete the work of the greatest of all sultans, to bring Christendom to its knees, and to secure Kara Mustafa's place in history. He painted this vision for his master, Sultan Mehmed IV, a ruler more interested in the hunt than in the complexities of state. The Grand Vizier's words were persuasive, his promises intoxicating. And so, the great war machine of the empire began to grind into motion. From Anatolia to Egypt, from the Balkans to the Black Sea, the summons went out. Banners were unfurled, cannons were cast, and the vast multi-ethnic army of the Padishah began its slow, inexorable march towards the Danube. For Suleiman, locked in his cage, these preparations were like a dream. He might hear the distant clang of a forge or the rumble of wagons passing beyond the palace walls. He would notice the change in the guards' demeanor, a new arrogance, a new excitement. The empire was moving towards its destiny, a grand, earth-shattering gamble. And he, the prince who had been waiting for nearly 4 decades, could only sit and listen to the muffled drums of a war that felt as though it belonged to another world. In the summer of 1683, the storm broke. A sea of silk tents, over 170,000 strong, flooded the plains before Vienna. At its heart was the opulent encampment of Kara Mustafa Pasha, a city in itself, filled with luxuries that spoke of absolute confidence. The crescent banner flew high, a declaration of intent to the terrified defenders huddled behind the city's aging walls. The grandest siege of the century had begun. The Ottoman sappers, masters of their craft, began to dig. A complex web of trenches snaked towards the ramparts, zigzagging to protect the attackers from cannon fire. From these trenches, miners burrowed deep underground, packing charges of gunpowder to tear open the belly of the fortress. Day and night, the air thundered with the roar of Ottoman artillery, great bronze bombards hurling stone and iron against the defiant walls. The psychological pressure was immense. Kara Mustafa, believing the city's fall to be inevitable, demanded unconditional surrender. He envisioned a triumphant entry, the plunder of a European capital, a prize that would make him the most celebrated vizier in Ottoman history. His hubris was his guide. While this epic drama unfolded, Prince Suleiman passed his 39th year in confinement. The name Vienna may have reached him, a whisper of a great victory to come. But what could it mean to him? It was a geographical abstraction, a sound without substance. While thousands fought and died, while an empire gambled its future on a single throw of the dice, his reality remained unchanged. The same 4 walls, the same silent servants, the same dread of the executioner's bowstring that had haunted him since childhood. The fate of the world was being decided hundreds of miles away, driven by the ambitions of men he would never meet. He was a spectator to his own era, a prisoner of a history that was happening without him. The roar of the cannons bombarding Vienna was a sound he would never hear, yet its echo would soon bring his own silent world crashing down. For 2 months, Vienna held on, its defenders pushed to the brink of starvation and collapse. Kara Mustafa, obsessed with taking the city intact for its riches, delayed the final assault. It was a fatal miscalculation. On the 12th of September, from the heights of the Kahlenberg overlooking the siege, a new army appeared. Banners bearing the cross, not the crescent, glittered in the morning sun. A coalition force, the Holy League, led by the warrior king of Poland, Jan III Sobieski, had arrived. The battle that followed was not a battle, it was a cataclysm. The turning point came with a sound that would haunt the nightmares of Ottoman soldiers for generations, the thunder of hooves. Sobieski led the largest cavalry charge in history, his legendary winged hussars descending upon the Ottoman flank like an avalanche. The disciplined Ottoman lines, weary from the long siege and caught utterly by surprise, shattered. Panic became a contagion. The elite janissaries fought bravely, but were overwhelmed. The vast army, which had seemed invincible just hours before, dissolved into a terrified mob. Kara Mustafa, seeing his life's ambition turn to ash, tried desperately to rally his men, but it was hopeless. The retreat became a rout, a frantic scramble to escape the Christian swords. Left behind was everything: cannons, treasure, supplies, and the sacred standard of the Prophet. The Grand Vizier's magnificent tent was captured, its luxuries now spoils of war. More than the material loss, something far more precious was broken that day: the myth of Ottoman invincibility. The news of this disaster travelled back to Istanbul not as a single report, but as a slow, creeping poison. Rumours of a setback became whispers of a major defeat, which then swelled into the horrifying truth of a complete collapse. In the Topkapi Palace, the air grew thick with fear. For Prince Suleiman in the Kafes, the change was palpable. The confident swagger of the palace guards vanished, replaced by furtive glances and hushed, anxious conversations. The tremors of the defeat at Vienna had reached the very heart of the empire, shaking the foundations of power and cracking the walls of his gilded prison. The disaster at Vienna was not an end, but a beginning. It ignited the Great Turkish War, a conflict that saw the Holy League push the Ottomans back across the Balkans. Hungary, once a secure Ottoman province, was lost. Belgrade fell. Defeat followed defeat, each one a fresh wound to imperial pride. The empire was bleeding, and in Istanbul, the people demanded someone be held accountable. Sultan Mehmed IV, in a desperate bid to save his own throne, offered up his Grand Vizier. The head of Kara Mustafa, the architect of the Vienna campaign, was brought to the Sultan in a velvet bag. But the sacrifice was not enough. The anger of the army, particularly the janissaries, could not be so easily appeased. Their pay was in arrears, their ranks were decimated, and they blamed the Sultan, the hunter, who had neglected the state for his own pleasures, for their humiliation. In 1687, 4 years after the Vienna debacle, the army in Hungary mutinied. Led by their commanders, they turned their backs on the frontier and began the long march back to the capital. This was not a foreign enemy. This was the Sultan's own sword turning against him. The janissaries arrived at the gates of Istanbul not as protectors, but as kingmakers. They joined with the city's ulama, the religious establishment, and issued an ultimatum. Sultan Mehmed IV must abdicate. The hunter king, who had reigned for 39 years, was cornered. His power evaporated, his authority meaningless before the rage of his own soldiers. And so, the great wheel of fate, which had stood still for so long, began to turn. Palace officials, their faces grim, walked down the silent corridors towards the cafes. They unbolted the heavy doors that had been sealed for a lifetime. Inside, a pale, bearded man in his late 40s looked up, his eyes unaccustomed to so many strangers. This was Suleiman, the prince who had known nothing but this room since he was a child. He expected death. He had expected it every day for 39 years. Instead, the officials bowed low. They informed him that his brother was deposed and that he, the forgotten prisoner, was now Suleiman II, Padishah of the Ottoman Empire, shadow of God on earth. The cage was open, but the world he was being thrust into was a storm of war, rebellion, and imminent collapse. For 39 years, the world had been a gilded cage, a suite of rooms in the Topkapi Palace known as the Kafes, where the air was thick with silence, prayer, and the ever-present spectre of the executioner's bowstring. Here, Prince Suleiman had aged from a boy of 6 to a man of 45. His world was one of books, calligraphy, and the whispered rumours of the empire his brother, Mehmed IV, ruled. Every day was a repetition of the last, a life lived in the shadow of a throne he was forbidden to approach, and a death that could arrive without warning. But on the 8th of November, 1687, the silence was broken. It was not the quiet shuffle of servants bringing his meals, nor the distant call to prayer. It was the sound of heavy boots, of clanking armor, of urgent, powerful men approaching his secluded world. The sounds grew louder, echoing in the long disused corridors leading to his chambers. For Suleiman, this could mean only one thing: the end. He had seen his brothers, Ahmed and Selim, led from these same rooms, never to return. He steeled himself, perhaps reciting a final prayer. The great door, sealed for decades, groaned open. Light, harsh and unfamiliar, flooded the chamber, silhouetting the figures of the empire's most powerful men: the Grand Vizier, the Sheikh-ul-Islam, the chief officers of the Janissaries. They stared at the pale, bearded prince who blinked back at them, his eyes unaccustomed to so many faces. He saw no pity in their expressions, only grim purpose. He braced for the command, the final fatal order. But the words that came were not what he expected. They were not a sentence of death, but an invitation to a destiny he had long since abandoned. The Grand Vizier, Siyavush Pasha, bowed low. "The people and the army await their new Padishah," he declared. "The throne of Osman is yours." In that moment, the cage door was finally unlocked. But for the terrified prince, it felt as though the door to a far more terrible prison had just been thrown open. The pronouncement hung in the stale air of the Kafes, a proclamation of supreme power that sounded to Suleiman like a curse. Joy? Relief? There was none. Only a surge of pure, unadulterated terror, the culmination of a lifetime of dread. He looked at the stern faces of the viziers and agas, and saw not saviors, but harbingers of a fate worse than the swift death he had anticipated. He recoiled, shaking his head, his voice a hoarse whisper from years of disuse. "No," he pleaded. "If my death is ordered, say so at once. Let me perform my ablutions and my prayers, and then carry out your order." He looked from one man to another, his eyes wide with a sincere, desperate plea. "Since my childhood, I have been suffering the terrors of death every single day. It is better to die at once than to die a little every day." His words were not the theatrical protest of a man feigning humility. They were the raw, honest cry of a soul that had been systematically broken. The world of power, of war, of intrigue and betrayal, the world outside his cage, was a place of calamity and sin he wanted no part of. "God!" he cried out, his voice cracking with emotion. "Do not make me the tool of the calamities of this world. I have preferred death to this false world." The officials were stunned into silence. They had expected a grateful, pliant prince. Instead, they faced a pious ascetic who saw the imperial throne not as a divine gift, but as a path to damnation. They had to reason with him, to persuade him. The empire was on the brink of collapse, the army was in mutiny, and a vacant throne would mean total anarchy. They explained that his accession was the will of the people, the army, and of God himself. They cajoled, they insisted, they almost threatened. For what felt like an eternity, Suleiman resisted, clinging to the grim safety of his confinement. He was a man who had made his peace with oblivion, only to have a crown thrust upon his head. Reluctantly, fearfully, he was led from his cage, a prisoner being transferred to a larger, more dangerous prison, the Ottoman Empire itself. The throne Suleiman inherited was not the magnificent seat of a global superpower. It was a wreck adrift in a sea of fire. The empire was bleeding from a dozen wounds, embroiled in the catastrophic Great Turkish War against the combined might of Europe's Holy League. From the Balkans to the Black Sea, Ottoman armies were in retreat, fortresses were falling, and the treasury was utterly, catastrophically empty. The very soldiers who had deposed his brother Mehmed IV were now a mutinous mob rampaging through the streets of Constantinople. They had been promised a generous accession bonus, the traditional kulus bashishi, but there was no money to pay them. The accession ceremony itself was a hurried, tense affair, devoid of splendor. As Suleiman was girded with the sword of Osman, the sacred symbol of his authority, the cheers from the courtyard were drowned out by the angry shouts of soldiers demanding their gold. The situation was desperate. To quell the immediate threat, palace officials resorted to melting down everything of value they could find. Golden platters, silver ewers, priceless ornaments from the palace treasury were thrown into the crucibles, converted into hastily minted coins to appease the ravenous mob. It was a temporary reprieve, a stopgap that solved nothing. The new sultan, a man whose only experience of governance was reading about it in books, was faced with an impossible task. He was surrounded by ambitious pashas who had their own agendas, and he was the ruler of an army that had just demonstrated its willingness to overthrow any master who failed to satisfy its demands. His first days were a whirlwind of crisis meetings and terrifying reports from the frontiers. Belgrade, a key strategic fortress, was under imminent threat. The Austrians were pushing deeper into Ottoman territory. The Venetians were conquering Greece. For a man who had spent 40 years in quiet contemplation, the sheer scale of the chaos was overwhelming. This was not a crown of gold and jewels he had been given. It was a crown of thorns, pressing down on him with the weight of a dying empire. Sultan Suleiman II may have been on the throne, but power, he quickly learned, resided with the man who had put him there, Grand Vizier Siyavush Pasha. The Pasha, an Abkhazian slave who had risen through the ranks, had orchestrated the coup, believing he could control the reclusive new sultan and rule the empire himself. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had unleashed the fury of the Janissaries, and that fury was a fire that could not be so easily contained. The accession bonus, paid for with melted palace treasures, had only whetted the soldiers' appetites. They demanded more. They accused Siyavush Pasha of holding back their pay and enriching himself. The chaos in the capital spiraled out of control. Renegade soldiers, known as Levins, roamed the streets, looting shops and terrorizing citizens. The Grand Vizier, who had once commanded the army's loyalty, now found himself its primary target. The end came swiftly and brutally. A massive armed mob of Janissaries and Sipahis marched on the Pasha's magnificent mansion, their rage stoked by rumors of his hidden wealth. Siyavush Pasha, a warrior to the last, refused to flee. Barricading himself inside with his household retainers, he attempted to make a stand, but it was hopeless. The mob smashed through the gates, overwhelming his few defenders. They dragged the Grand Vizier from his home, tearing his fine robes, and murdered him in the street with savage ferocity. From the windows of the Topkapi Palace, Sultan Suleiman could hear the roar of the mob and surely received terrifying reports of the events. The man who had unlocked his cage, the kingmaker who had placed the crown on his head, was now a mutilated corpse, a victim of the very anarchy he had created. It was a horrifying, sobering lesson for the new sultan. It taught him that power in the Ottoman state was a fragile, fleeting thing. It demonstrated that no one, not even the Grand Vizier, was safe from the army's wrath. The brutal death of Siyavush Pasha was a baptism by fire for Suleiman. The buffer between him and the chaos was gone. Now, he alone had to face the storm. The doors of the Kafes, the gilded cage, had finally swung open. But for Suleiman, freedom was not a sun-drenched garden. It was the howling mouth of a tempest. After 39 years of silence, solitude, and the ever-present shadow of the executioner's silk cord, he was thrust onto the serpent column in the Hippodrome, proclaimed Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. The cheers of the crowd were a hollow echo against the drumbeat of impending disaster. He did not inherit a throne. He inherited a catastrophe. The Great Turkish War, a conflict that had bled the empire for years, was at its nadir. The Holy League, a formidable alliance of European powers, was carving away at the empire's frontiers with a butcher's knife. In Hungary, the historic fortress of Buda had fallen, a wound that wept in the Ottoman psyche. The Venetians were seizing territory in Greece, the Poles advanced in the north, and the Habsburgs pushed deeper into the Balkans, threatening the very heartlands of Rumelia. The treasury, plundered by years of mismanagement and the exorbitant demands of a mutinous army, was utterly empty. The Janissaries, who had just deposed his brother Mehmed IV, were a law unto themselves, their loyalty for sale to the highest bidder, and the state had no currency left to offer. From the suffocating quiet of his cell, Suleiman was now besieged by the cacophony of a collapsing world. Every dispatch brought news of another defeat, another fortress lost, another province in revolt. He was a man who had only known the dimensions of a few gilded rooms, now tasked with holding together a sprawling empire that was tearing itself apart at the seams. His first act as Sultan was not to savor his power, but to face the terrifying reality that he might be its last true sovereign. The weight of 3 centuries of Ottoman glory, now tarnished and cracking, settled upon the shoulders of a man who had scarcely been allowed to see the sun. In the face of overwhelming despair, a flicker of the old Ottoman spirit stirred within the long-imprisoned prince. Suleiman II could have remained in the Topkapi Palace, a figurehead delegating the grim business of war. But he understood something fundamental about power and morale. A ghost could not lead an army. The empire needed a sultan, not a rumour. In a decision that shocked the court, he announced he would personally lead the imperial army on campaign. This was a man who had not ridden a horse in 4 decades, whose knowledge of military strategy came from books read in gilded isolation. Yet, he chose the harsh reality of the field over the insulated comfort of the palace. His most crucial decision, however, was not in tactics, but in personnel. He recognized his own limitations and sought out brilliance. He found it in Köprülü Fazıl Mustafa Pasha, a man of integrity and ruthless efficiency from the famed Köprülü family of Grand Vizier. Appointing him was a masterstroke. Together, they formed an unlikely but potent partnership. The stoic, determined Sultan and his ferociously competent Grand Vizier. They moved with purpose. Fazıl Mustafa Pasha purged the corrupt, reformed the administration, and refilled the treasury with a series of bold, sometimes brutal, fiscal measures. With the state's finances stabilized, they could finally pay the army. Morale, so long at rock bottom, began to climb. In 1690, the imperial standard was raised, and the Sultan, despite his frail health, marched with his troops. The campaign was a stunning reversal of fortune. They swept through the Balkans, recapturing Niš, Smederevo, and, most symbolically, the mighty fortress of Belgrade. The Sultan was on the front, a visible embodiment of the empire's will to survive. He was not a warrior king in the mold of his ancestors, but his presence alone was a powerful message. The House of Osman had not yet abandoned the fight. Victory on the battlefield could not conquer the enemy that lay within. The 39 years in the Kafes had inflicted wounds far deeper than any sword. Suleiman's body, a vessel that had carried him through decades of profound psychological torment, was failing him. The long confinement, the lack of movement, the constant stress, and the poor diet of a prince held in limbo had taken their inexorable toll. Now, the immense pressures of rule and the physical rigors of a military campaign accelerated his decline. He suffered from dropsy, what we now call edema. It was a cruel and debilitating illness. His body retained fluid, swelling his limbs and abdomen, making every movement an exercise in agony. The man who had marched with his army to restore the empire's honor could soon barely walk. The condition was relentless, a constant painful reminder of his stolen youth. While his Grand Vizier, Fazıl Mustafa Pasha, prosecuted the war with vigor, the Sultan was forced to retreat, first to his campaign tent and then back to the capital. He was a prisoner once more, not in a gilded cage of marble and gold, but in the cage of his own flesh and bone. There is a profound tragedy in this irony. At the very moment he was most needed, at the height of his purpose after a lifetime of waiting, his body betrayed him. He had endured the silence, the fear, the madness of the Kafes, only to be granted a few fleeting years of freedom before being dragged down by its physical legacy. He continued to rule from his sickbed in Edirne, his mind still sharp, his will unbroken, but his physical presence, which had been so vital to the war effort, was gone. The waiting prince had become the dying sultan, his final battle fought not against the Habsburgs, but against the ghosts of his own past, manifested in the water that was slowly drowning him from within. On a summer day in 1691, less than 4 years after ascending to the throne, Sultan Suleiman II succumbed to his illness. His reign was a brief, desperate, yet noble footnote in the grand saga of the Ottoman Empire. He was not a conqueror like his namesake, Suleiman the Magnificent. He did not preside over a golden age. His legacy is quieter, more complex, and perhaps more profound. What does one make of a man who waited 40 years for a crown he would only wear for 4? His story is not one of glorious achievement, but of incredible resilience. He inherited an empire in absolute freefall, a state on the verge of disintegration. The fact that the Ottoman Empire survived the 17th century at all is in no small part due to the brief stabilization he provided. By appointing the brilliant Fazıl Mustafa Pasha and backing his reforms, Suleiman stopped the bleeding. He restored a measure of discipline to the army and a semblance of solvency to the treasury. He even introduced measures to protect his non-Muslim subjects from corrupt officials, a remarkably enlightened policy for a ruler in a time of holy war. He demonstrated that even a man broken by circumstance could rise to meet the demands of duty. He proved that leadership was not just about military prowess, but about wisdom, humility, and the courage to empower those more capable than oneself. His tragedy is that the cage that made him sultan also killed him. It stole his health and his time, preventing him from seeing his reforms through to their conclusion. The war would continue to rage, and his brilliant Grand Vizier would fall in battle shortly after his own death. Yet, Suleiman II, the waiting prince, left an indelible mark. His reign was a testament to the idea that even from the deepest darkness, a sense of purpose can emerge, and that a life defined by imprisonment can find its ultimate meaning in a few short years of selfless service.